The Alabama Booksmith presents Author Spotlight. Because every book in our store is signed, our Wall of Fame displays a breathtaking array of writers and signatures. Close-up shots reveal giants of literature, acclaimed historians, stars of stage and screen, our nation's leaders, famous sports heroes, and thousands of other esteemed authors. Today's Wall of Fame guest is Ian Toll, who will discuss his Pacific War trilogy, The Pacific Crucible, The Conquering Tide, and Twilight of the Gods. And here is our host, Jake Reese.
Welcome. We are proud and excited to be in conversation with Ian Toll from his home in New York.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for taking time to be with us. Are you well?
I am well, yes, sir. I think I've avoided the plague so far, and I'm excited to have this book launching.
Well, we know you are. With the release of the third volume, the Pacific War trilogy is now complete.
Yes, it is.
Twilight of the Gods, get this sucker out. I need to go to weightlifting class. Twilight of the Gods joins Pacific Crucible. Put this down. These suckers are heavy. And The Conquering Tide, to give readers and collectors the definitive history of the longest lasting theater of action in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
How does it feel to spend a goodly part of your adult life researching and writing this amazing work, and now you're done, finished? How does that feel?
Well, it's a mixed feeling, really. I mean, I'm very proud to have completed it. There were times when I had wondered whether I had it in me to write this 3 volumes. So, I'm very pleased. I'm very, very happy with the way the third book turned out. In some ways, I think it's the strongest of the 3. I'm also conscious of having, really turned the page. I've been at this now for really 14 years, but I am very pleased with the result. Well,
so are we. We feel this masterful setting, it is masterful, joined Shelby Foote's Civil War narrative and Rick Atkinson's Liberation trilogy as must-have treasures for any complete library. As expected, these 2,040 pages contain battle information, pluses and minuses of specific ships, planes, bombs, armament along the way from Pearl Harbor to the final surrender. However, we are most impressed at learning underlying reasons for this war in the first place. Mm-hmm. Including Japanese and American politics at the time, as well as the squabbles and it seemed like almost downright revolution inside the different military branches on both sides. Ian, give our viewers an inside peek at the clashes between the Army and Navy of Japan and likewise between the armed services in this country.
Sure. Well, as you say, Jake, the issue of service rivalries was right at the heart of the conflict on both sides. At the same time, it was very different. We'll take them one at a time. In Japan, the Army and the Navy were, it might be a little bit may go too far to say that they were outright enemies, but at times they really did treat each other as if they were enemies. Really going back to the Meiji period when Japan had first set out to build a world-class military. The Army and the Navy had been separate power centers, and they really had been the 2 dominant power centers in the country, and that continued right up until 1945. And so the struggle between the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy really was at the heart of all the big decisions that the militarist imperialist regime made. It was at the heart of their decision to plunge into war against the United States and Britain in December 1941. It really dictated the Japanese strategy to send their forces south to take the Philippines, Malaya, Burma, Indonesia, what was then called the Dutch East Indies. In the American case, service rivalries have always been an issue, not just in this country, but in other countries as well. And the struggle between the Army, the Navy, the Army Air Corps, which became the Air Force, the struggle within the Navy between the Marines and the Navy, between the aviators and what they called the black shoes, the surface warship officers. All of these different kind of fiefdoms within the military had their own case to make about what role they were going to play in winning this war. And those service rivalries really did influence a lot of the major decisions that were made, in particular in the Pacific, because the Pacific was an amphibious war. It was a naval war principally, and an air war. And the air war was carried out by both the Navy and the Army. And so you really had a situation that was kind of ready-made for some pretty acrimonious internal conflicts over exactly how the war should be fought. And then, of course, in the Pacific, you also had the division of the Pacific into two different theater commands, one under Nimitz, dominated by the Navy, one under MacArthur, dominated by MacArthur.
That's a fascinating insight that I think adds so much to your books. You are a uniquely qualified historian who has served as a cultural ambassador for the U.S. State Department and a lecturer at the Naval College, and you have a boatload of awards for these books that have been translated into many languages, and you're a New York Times bestseller. That being said, since your many degrees include a master's in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, will you please set the stage politically here and in Japan prior to the Pearl Harbor attack?
Sure. Well, Japan, just to pick up really from what we were just talking about, you had this, you had a society that was dominated by the military caste. That's something that had gone back to samurai days. And so the Army and the Navy really were in control of that country, every aspect, not just military affairs, but political affairs as well. Japan had made the tragic and ultimately foolhardy decision to sign an alliance with Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy, the Axis, forming the Axis alliance. And so they had really yoked themselves to the destiny of Germany in Europe. They had placed an enormous wager on the future of Japan, betting that Hitler was going to defeat both Russia and Great Britain in Europe and would be the master of Europe. And of course, that, as we now know, that was a very bad bet. Is that Japan is and still is a country that's basically destitute of natural resources. And so from the time that in the Meiji period that Japan decided we're going to be a world power, they realized they needed to secure access to oil, to coal, to minerals, and to other natural resources. And for the first several decades after the Meiji Restoration, the beginning of that period, they were able to do that through international trade. In the 1930s, with the ascendancy of a much more kind of aggressive, imperialist, war-minded clique in the Japanese, both the Japanese Army and the Navy, Army in particular, they decided actually it's not enough for us to access these things through trade. We want to control these resources. And so that more than anything was the impetus for them to go on this military adventure of conquest in Asia. After their sudden attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, simultaneously attacking Great Britain, they launched this naval aerial amphibious blitzkrieg that took the world by surprise with how quickly and how effectively they were able to move. They took the Philippines, they took Malaya, they took Burma, they took Wake Island, Guam, and then as early as February 1942, they were seizing territories in the Dutch East Indies, Borneo and Sumatra, where you had the most productive oil fields in Asia. And so, I think Japan, 1941, that's a good example of an authoritarian regime where they had stamped out, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. They had suppressed essentially all political elements that were opposed to this military ascendancy. And one result of that was an inability to make rational national decisions. We saw something similar happen in Germany during the Third Reich. In this country, you had this tremendous struggle before Pearl Harbor between what they call the interventionists and the isolationists that went on for years. And FDR, championed this policy of trying to help the Allies in Europe, Great Britain in particular, and was opposed by the isolationists who really wanted to maintain an arm's length posture toward all of these conflicts overseas. And that was a virulent conflict and debate. The isolationists, I think you can make a good case that they were actually getting stronger in the months just leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that sudden attack on Pearl Harbor essentially destroyed that entire movement literally overnight. It's remarkable. I don't think you can point to another example in American history when a political movement that had as much energy and as much influence as the isolationist movement did, cutting across both parties, Democrats, Republicans, cutting across the political spectrum. You had liberals who were isolationists as well as conservatives, and collapsed literally overnight when the Japanese, maybe did us a favor in the long run, politically speaking, by attacking Pearl Harbor.
Well, that gives us such an understanding and an insight that I think many folks who devour everything they can on World War II could use that I loved in your books. As we said before, your work gives readers so much more than combat at sea, in the air, and on beaches. But of course, those issues and facts are necessary for this important keepsake. How about, if you will, pick just one important battle and let us know the strategy of what went right and what did not in a decisive battle?
Sure. Well, I think the decisive battle of the Pacific War was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which took place in June 1944. And this was a major naval battle that occurred at the time when our forces were invading the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Guam, Tinian. These were islands that were not far from Japan, a little more than 1,200 miles from Japan, south of Japan. And our forces had landed on Saipan in the same month that we launched the D-Day invasion. So just as an aside, what an extraordinary demonstration of what was then the military industrial power of the United States to be able to launch the two largest amphibious invasions in the history of warfare on opposite ends of the Eurasian landmass, one in Europe, one in the Pacific, in the same month, and to win both of those invasions. So We had put ashore on this island of Saipan. It was a terrible and bloody battle, but we won it. We were winning it when the Japanese fleet came out to challenge that amphibious invasion. And the fleet that the Japanese sent into battle was the largest and most powerful that they had ever assembled. Their first mobile fleet under Admiral Ozawa had 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships, including the Yamato and the Musashi, which were the 2 largest battleships in the world, 2 largest warships in the world. And they came through the Philippines, through the island barrier at the middle of the archipelago, the Philippines, came through San Bernardino Strait, and were approaching the Marianas from the west. Our naval forces, the Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance, and the Carrier Striking Force, which was under Admiral Mark Mitcher, was off the coast of the Marianas, covering that invasion, covering the vulnerable amphibious and logistics fleets that were gathered there to support the Marines and the Army in their invasion of Saipan. Was interposed between the vulnerable beachhead and this approaching Japanese fleet. The carrier airmen and Admiral Mitcher requested permission to move west on the night of June 18th, so that the US carriers would be in a position to launch attacks directly on the Japanese fleet. Admiral Spruance, in a what was a conservative and it turns out a controversial decision, replied in the negative and said that he wanted the fleet to remain in the vicinity of the beachhead in order to protect the amphibious fleet and to guard against a potential, which he said he regarded as a low percentage risk, but still a risk that the Japanese would detach a separate naval task force to try to make an end run around the Fifth Fleet to get at that vulnerable amphibious fleet that lay offshore off of Saipan. So the upshot was that on the morning of June 19th, the Japanese were in a position where they could launch enormous carrier airstrikes against the Fifth Fleet, and the Fifth Fleet could not respond with attacks on the Japanese fleet because of the range, because of the proximity of Japanese air bases on those islands, and because of the wind, the direction of the wind. The carriers have to steam into the wind to launch and recover aircraft. So you had waves of Japanese airplanes, very large waves of Japanese airplanes descending on the US fleet. But by that time in the war, the American aviators were simply much better than their Japanese counterparts. The best Japanese aviators by that time had been shot down or had been lost in operational accidents. So what you had was a very one-sided aerial encounter in which the Japanese planes were basically massacred, and about 300 Japanese planes went down in that one morning of battle. The American aviators nicknamed it the Marianas Turkey Shoot, which gives you some idea of what kind of an aerial battle that was. And then in the ensuing 24 hours, Spruance cut Mitcher loose, so the US carrier task forces chased the Japanese fleet and were able to launch one airstrike late on the night of June 20th, sinking a carrier and several other ships. 2 other Japanese carriers were also destroyed by submarine attacks during the battle. And the issue of Saipan was taken. It was, as I said, a bloody battle. There were many Japanese civilians living on the island. Many of them took their own lives, so it was a pretty awful scene. We then went on to take Guam and Tinian. And
wow, well, that brings us closer to the conclusion and of the war, and we could spend an eternity discussing our decision to drop the bomb. But would you give us your take on the options and why you think that President Truman thought this was the best course of action.
Sure. Well, it was a complex picture in August 1945. It was, as I say, clear that we had won the war. It was clear even to the Japanese, it was clear that they had lost. And yet you had, in this military-dominated regime, you had very, very strong resistance to the idea of surrender, particularly in the Japanese army, and particularly in the middle ranks of the Japanese army. And so the question that lay before us was how to force the Japanese to accept the terms of surrender that we're offering, which is essentially unconditional surrender. We were going to occupy that country. We were going to disarm the country. We were going to ensure that the militarist regime was eliminated, that the influence of the militarist caste in Japan was forever eliminated. We were going to put the war criminals on trial. And we were going to supervise the reconstruction of Japan on democratic lines. And that was going to happen regardless. So it was a hard or easy kind of situation. If necessary, we were going to invade that country. But an invasion would have been a terrible event. It would have been terrible for us. It would have been terrible for the Japanese as well. The Manhattan Project happened to produce a successful test in July 1945. And so really just by sort of a fluke, we ended up with a bomb available after the defeat of Nazi Germany, but before the defeat of Japan. The assumption had always been that if we built this weapon, we would use it to end the war. And so there was a very strong assumption underlying this entire project that if, after investing these enormous resources in building this weapon, if we obtained it, we would use it. And so really you could almost say that Truman didn't make an affirmative decision to use the bomb. He simply accepted the set of assumptions that he had inherited upon taking office in April upon the death of FDR. The committees that were set up to recommend how to use the bomb had recommended to Truman that it should be used without warning against a list of target cities. These target cities were chosen not because of their military character, but because they were relatively unscathed by conventional bombing and had the topographical features that the committees judged would give the best expression to the bomb's power. So really the idea was to essentially demonstrate the power of this new weapon in the most dramatic way possible. Now, it is a very controversial issue, the use of the atomic bombs, not just the use, but also the use against cities. I think that's the hard question, is whether or not we should have directed the first one at least against a military target. And there were many other things going on at that time. There was this developing conflict with the Soviet Union, which of course they were our allies at that point, but we were in serious conflict with them over a number of issues all around the world, many of them having to do with the political independence of Eastern Europe. And the Russians had pledged to come into the war against Japan. They would enter the war 3 months after the defeat of Germany. They had made that pledge explicit. Stalin had pledged that to FDR at the Yalta Conference. So we knew the Russians were coming into the war. After the successful test of the nuclear weapon in New Mexico on July 16th, the question arose, do we still want the Russians to help us? And there was a view among many of Truman's advisors that we actually didn't want the Russians in the war, because once they rolled their tanks into Manchuria, what was to stop them from continuing into China, taking all of Korea, taking the Kuril Islands, taking the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and ultimately perhaps even landing troops in Japan? And we now know, because of declassifications of documents and so forth, that Stalin did in fact want a role in the occupation of Japan, and he wanted his forces to take the island of Hokkaido. Hokkaido is the northernmost of the 4 main islands of Japan. So Part of the consideration then in using the bomb, and I think this has been established, was to impress, perhaps intimidate the Soviet Union with the fact that we had this weapon. They didn't, that we were ruthless enough to use it, and to try to force the Japanese surrender to come quickly, to run out the clock on the war as quickly as possible, so that the Red Army could not take too much more territory in Asia, territory from which they would not be dislodged. And so those were all factors as well in the decision to drop the bomb. And I think the history shows that the shock of the atomic bombings did have an important influence in Tokyo and the political decision finally to surrender. The decision to allow the emperor to decide for his deadlocked cabinet what the decision would be, and then created the conditions in Tokyo where the armed forces accepted that decision. And the armed forces overseas as well, in China and elsewhere, also accepted the emperor's decision and laid down arms without fighting on. And so the bomb certainly did have an important role to play in the end of the war, along with this sudden declaration of war by the Russians. As I say, I think the hard question with the atomic bombs is not whether or not we should have used them. I think given the circumstances, the peculiar circumstances of that time, using this new weapon was justified. I think the hard question is whether we should have dropped it on a city. And that's something that will never be settled. No amount of historical research will reveal the answer to that. That's a difficult moral and ethical question. My own view, and again, it's different from an argument, it's my own view, is that I think it was worth, in terms of the long run reputation and standing of the United States, I think I would have preferred to see the first one used against a legitimate military target rather than a city.
Wow, that's an amazing way to end this comprehensive Pacific War trilogy, which I can't imagine anybody claiming to own a library and not having this set. Ian Toll, we are honored to have had you visit. We're overwhelmed with your work. We hope your next book signing will be down here in Birmingham and not virtual.
I'd love to do it.
Thank you so much for signing the hundreds of books. I hope you don't have writer's cramps.
No, my wrist is doing just fine. Thank you.
Well,
I enjoyed it. And thanks very much for having me on this program.
Oh, thank you. And thank all of you for watching, and stay tuned.
To purchase these books, signed on a beautiful book plate, go to alabamabooksmith.com.